The stars looked wrong the night Kenji Mori decided the world was not going to end. He was 41 years old, standing on the roof of the Kuramoto Observatory in shirt sleeves despite the November cold, a thermos of green tea going lukewarm in his hand, and he was watching something that had no business being where it was. The object moved across the field of the main scope, like a slow heartbeat, not a satellite, not a weather balloon, not the usual excuses he gave reporters who called at odd hours looking for a quote. It pulsed, it breathed, it slid between the stars with a kind of deliberate patience that made Kenji's chest go tight, in a way he hadn't felt since the night his daughter was born. He did not call anyone. He poured the rest of his tea off the roof and watched the light until it disappeared over the horizon toward the bay. And then he went inside, sat at his desk, and opened a fresh notebook. He wrote the time, the trajectory, the apparent luminosity. His handwriting was very neat. It had always been neat, ever since his mother had drilled it into him as a boy in Osaka, back when the city was still half rubble and neatness was one of the few things a person could still control. He wrote, "Unknown. Repeat observation required." Then he went home to his wife, ate dinner, and said nothing about what he had seen. The objects came back 3 nights later. This time, there were 6 of them. Toru Hayashi saw them first through the wide field scope, called out to his colleague Sato, and by the time Kenji arrived from his office, they had already begun photographing. The images came back blurry and too distant to mean anything, but the trajectory data was unambiguous. They were holding station over Tokyo Bay, not orbiting, not passing through. Holding fishermen in Odaiba reported lights on the water around midnight, Toru said. He was 24 and had the kind of enthusiasm that Kenji found exhausting and also secretly wonderful. 3 separate calls to the Coast Guard. All described the same thing, a light that came up out of the bay and moved toward the Shibuya docks. What did the Coast Guard find? Nothing. Kenji nodded. He looked at the photos for a long time. Then he called Dr. Matsuda. Rika Matsuda was 53 and had the bearing of someone who had stopped caring what people thought of her somewhere around 1972. She ran the Theoretical Physics Division at the National Research Institute, had published work in 4 languages, and kept a small calico cat named Kappa on her office whistlesill who hated everyone except her. When Kenji laid the photos on her desk at 7 in the morning without preamble, she looked at them for exactly as long as it took her to drink half her coffee, and then she said, "How many?" 6 objects. Possibly more. The bay pattern suggests they're using it as an anchor point. Using it. She said this the way a person says a word they have tasted before and are not sure they like. "You're saying they're parked." "I am." She looked at him over her cup. Outside, the first commuters were beginning to fill the street below her window. People in normal coats, carrying normal bags, moving through a normal morning, with no idea that the 2 people watching them from the 4th floor were discussing whether something from another star was sitting at the bottom of Tokyo Bay. "I have not slept," Kenji said. "I noticed." She set down the coffee. "Neither have I, as it happens. I got a call at 2 in the morning from a colleague in Hawaii. The Deep Space Array has been picking up a signal for the last 3 weeks. Very regular. Very structured. They thought it was instrument error until it started changing. Responding." Kenji sat down. "Responding to what?" "To us, to the satellite transponders, to the radar pings from the weather station over the Marianas." She paused. "To our mathematics, Kenji. Someone is out there doing math back at us." The word "someone" sat between them in the room like a physical object. They both looked at it and neither of them touched it for a long moment. "Then the things in the bay," Kenji said, "are probably an answer." The first full sighting happened on a Tuesday. A dock worker named Hideo, thick-necked, salt-haired, who had worked the Shibuya waterfront for 30 years and had a standing reputation for sobriety, came up from his morning inspection of the lower pier to find something standing at the end of the dock. He stopped. He looked. He was the kind of man who processed the world carefully and without drama, and so what he did was take off his work gloves, fold them, put them in his jacket pocket, and then stand very still and look at the thing for the better part of 90 seconds. It was roughly human-shaped in the way that a cathedral is roughly house-shaped. The fundamental architecture was present, but the scale and proportion were completely wrong. It was tall, taller than it should have been by at least a head, and its body spread and narrowed in planes that did not follow any animal logic Hideo had ever seen. 5 limbs, or possibly 7, arranged around a central mass. In the center of that mass, an eye. One eye, very large, deep amber, and looking at him with an expression He could not read, but which was not. His word, later, to his wife and then to the investigators. "Unkind," he said, "you're a long way from home." He said this because it was what he would have said to any stranger standing on his dock looking lost. The thing looked at him for another long moment, and then it turned and stepped off the edge of the pier and slid into the water and was gone. Egidio stood there. Then he went and got his supervisor. The investigation that followed was frantic and quiet in equal measure, which is the way governments prefer their panics. Kenji was brought in on the third day, Rika on the fourth, and by the end of the first week there were 17 scientists, 8 government liaisons, 3 Coast Guard vessels, and 1 very unhappy Defense Ministry official sitting in a conference room in a building whose address did not appear on any public record. The bottom scan showed something, the defense official said. His name was Takahashi. He had the jaw of a man who believed in consequences, and he kept his hands flat on the table as though to stop them doing something he'd regret. Thermal signature, roughly 14 meters across, 50 meters down. It hasn't moved in 4 days. It's waiting, Rika said. For what? For us to do something other than point sonar at it. Takahashi looked at her like she'd said something obscene. Doctor, Matsuda, I need options, not philosophy. Those are the same thing at this stage. Kenji put his hand over his mouth to cover what was probably an inappropriate reaction. Under the table, his left knee was jumping, a habit from childhood, from exam anxiety, from the time before he had learned to sit still in rooms full of important men. He pressed it flat and looked at the overhead images. They came to us, he said. Whatever they are, they came here. Not to a military installation, not to a government building, to a public dock, to a working man doing his morning rounds. If they wanted confrontation, they had the option for it, and didn't take it. That means something. It means we don't know what it means, Takahashi said. It means, Kenji said carefully, that we should try saying hello before we try anything else. The decision to attempt contact was made at the highest levels, and then almost immediately undermined by the fact that no one agreed on what contact should look like. There were proposals, counter-proposals, a series of increasingly elaborate signal protocols drafted by increasingly tired people in increasingly coffee-stained clothes. Toru Hayashi, who had been brought to Tokyo and installed in a government apartment 3 blocks from the conference room, slept 4 hours a night and spent the rest of his time running calculations that nobody completely understood, but which everyone agreed felt important. On the 7th day, the thing in the bay solved the problem for them. It came out of the water at noon on a Wednesday, in broad daylight, on a public beach in Odaiba, in front of approximately 312 people who were eating lunch, walking dogs, and in 4 documented cases, asleep on benches. It stood at the waterline for a moment, that same tall, wrong-proportioned silhouette, that single amber eye, and then it walked up the beach toward the nearest group of humans, which happened to be a class of primary school students on a field trip. What followed was not, despite all later dramatic reconstruction, a scene of screaming and chaos. The children looked at the creature. Several of them looked at their teacher, a woman named Fumiko who was 26, and had an instinctive faith in the idea that children should not see adults be afraid. Fumiko looked at the creature. The creature looked at Fumiko. Then one of the children, a 7-year-old named Daichi, who would later grow up to be, in a cosmic irony that everyone would remark on, a marine biologist, walked forward and held out his lunchbox. The offering of a child's lunch is not a diplomatic protocol that appears in any government handbook, but the creature bent, those wrong-angled limbs folding in a way that somehow suggested a bow, and reached out a limb end toward lunchbox, and stopped just short of touching it, and looked at Daichi with that amber eye, and Daichi looked back, and the teacher Fumiko later said that in that moment what she felt was not fear but a kind of profound, aching recognition, like seeing a word in a language you don't speak and somehow understanding it anyway. By the time the Coast Guard arrived, the creature was gone. But it had left something. A pattern pressed into the wet sand, repeated 7 times in a line, a sequence of shapes that Toru Hayashi looked at for 6 hours straight before he went very pale and sat down and said, very quietly, "They're not warning us about themselves." The signal took 3 weeks to fully decode, and the process of decoding it was less a translation than a collaborative reconstruction. Toru and Rika, and 4 other mathematicians working in shifts, and on 2 occasions the signal itself responding to their partial interpretations, correcting errors with a patience that made the process feel less like cracking a code and more like being tutored. What it said in its fullest form was this: There is a body in motion. Its path intersects yours. The impact will occur in approximately 400 of your planetary rotations. We observed our own system's near destruction by similar means. We have come because we do not wish to watch another world end when we have the knowledge to help prevent it. And then, after a pause in the signal that lasted almost exactly the length of a human night, we are afraid of what you are. We are also afraid of what you will lose. We are asking you to let us help Kenji read the full transcript at 3 in the morning in the government facility, sitting alone with a cup of cold tea, and he felt something move through him that he had no good word for. It wasn't quite relief, wasn't quite terror. It was the feeling of a door opening in a wall you'd forgotten was a wall. He thought about his daughter. She was 17 now, already interested in physics, already asking the questions he had spent his whole career asking. She had her whole life ahead of her, and ahead of her life, apparently, was a piece of rock the size of a small moon moving toward them at 50 kilometers per second. He thought, not on my watch the world did not react well. This was perhaps the least surprising thing about the story. The discovery that an asteroid, the term they settled on in the official communications, though it was more technically a captured dwarf body, was on a collision course with Earth was processed by the global community with the same combination of denial, panic, political calculation, and occasional moments of genuine grace that humans apply to every overwhelming situation. The discovery that they had been warned by beings from another star system. Beings who had been parked in Tokyo Bay for 3 weeks waiting patiently for someone to say hello, added a layer of strangeness that no one's frameworks were quite built for. There were protests. There were panics. There were politicians who insisted the aliens were themselves the threat, that the message was a deception, that the proper response was a military one. There was a period of about 2 weeks in which it seemed entirely possible that humanity would manage to miss the actual problem by directing all its energy at the wrong one. Rika Matsuda spent most of that period in the conference room arguing. She was very good at it. Kenji spent it at the observatory, tracking the body they had designated Planet R. Tracking it the way you track something inevitable, with the flat attention of a person who refuses to look away. Toru spent it working on the weapon. The weapon was Rika's discovery, technically, or rather, the theoretical framework for it was a formula she had been developing for a decade as a pure thought experiment, a way of concentrating and releasing certain kinds of energy that had no practical application as far as anyone had imagined, until now. The Perrin, the name they had taken from the signal's self-reference, from a root that translated roughly as the ones watch stars, had recognized it. That was why they had come specifically to Tokyo. They had been monitoring human communications, scientific transmits, broadcast data for years, and Rika's work had pinged something in their databases, a set of equations that matched, imperfectly but unmistakably, a technology their own civilization had developed 600 years ago. The technology that had saved their world from exactly this kind of impact. You did the math, Toru told her, the night they finally understood what the connection was. He was 24 and exhausted and had stopped caring about being professionally deferential about 2 weeks ago. You did the math and you didn't know what it was for, and they saw it from 5 light years away and flew here to tell you. Rika looked at the formula on the board. She thought about the decade of work, the grant applications, the dismissive reviews, the colleagues who had called it elegant but impractical. She thought about her cat Kappa, who was currently being cared for by her sister in Kobe because she hadn't been home in 3 weeks. I had a feeling, she said, that it was important. The parent came fully to the surface on the 22nd day. Not one of them, all of them. There were, it turned out, 11 beings in the ship below the bay, and they came out of the water at sunrise on a morning in December when the bay was very still, and the sky was the particular deep orange that winter mornings in Tokyo sometimes achieve. And they walked up the beach and stood in a line and waited. Kenji was there, Toru was there, Rika was there in a coat that was too thin for the cold, but she had refused to go back for a heavier one. Takahashi from the Defense Ministry was there, standing 3 steps behind the scientists with his hands in his pockets, and an expression that suggested he was revising his assumptions about the universe in real time. The lead Paran was larger than the others. Not dramatically so, but noticeably, and moved with a kind of deliberate care, like a person choosing their words. It stopped 10 meters from the humans, and all 11 of them made a gesture together. The limbs spreading and lowering, that same fold and bow that Fumiko the teacher had described from the beach, an unmistakable gesture of submission, Of trust offered. Kenji bowed back, deeply from the waist, the way his father had taught him. Not a courtesy bow, not a professional bob, but a real one. Behind him he heard Toru do the same, and Rika, and after a moment, with a sound like a man swallowing something large, Takahashi. In the silence after that, something shifted. Kenji felt it in his chest. He would describe it later, to his daughter, and to journalists, and to a Senate panel, and eventually to the Nobel Committee, as the feeling of the world getting bigger and smaller simultaneously. Bigger because there was more of it than anyone had known. Smaller because suddenly, against all expectation, it felt possible to cross. The parents set up their communication array in a warehouse facility near the port, and the process of real collaboration began. It was not smooth. The technical vocabulary required to bridge two completely separate developmental histories of mathematics took weeks to establish. There were errors, misunderstandings, several moments where the entire framework collapsed and had to be rebuilt. Rika went gray in patches, which she said she had been expecting for years anyway. Toru lost 8 pounds. The lead Paran, who the team had taken to calling Hoshi, the closest phonetic approximation of the sound it used as a designation, developed what Kenji privately interpreted as a characteristic expression of gentle exasperation at the speed of human bureaucratic processes. But underneath all of it was something that moved faster than the bureaucracy, faster than the protocols, faster than anyone's philosophical adjustments. The problem moved, Planet R moved, and the people in that warehouse, human and Paran alike, were in a race with physics, which is the one opponent that doesn't negotiate and doesn't care how tired you are. The weapon required, in its final form, 3 components. Rika's energy concentration formula, the Paran propulsion technology that could deliver the payload with sufficient precision, and a delivery vessel built to human specifications, because the Paran's own ship was, as Hoshi communicated with what Kenji had come to read as dry humor, not designed for this particular application. The delivery vessel was Kenji's problem. He went back to the observatory for the first time in 6 weeks to think about it. He sat in his office with the telescope data spread across the desk and a fresh thermos of tea that was actually warm this time, and he thought about what he had, what humanity had, the production capacity, the engineering knowledge, the particular human talent for improvising solutions from inadequate materials under impossible time pressure. He thought about what the Parans had, and what they had not bothered to mention until asked, that their technology was extraordinary in range and power, but lacked a crucial quality that human engineering, for all its crudeness, had always had. Adaptability. The Paran propulsion system was perfect. It had been perfected over 600 years, and it worked exactly as designed, under exactly the conditions it had been designed for. Under any other conditions it failed completely. There was no redundancy, no workaround, no margin. Their world had 600 years of peace and stability, and no reason to build for chaos. Humans had nothing but reason. "I know what to do," Kenji told Toru, when he called him from the observatory at 2 in the morning. "Of course you do," Toru said, with the particular flatness of the extremely sleep-deprived. "What does it involve?" "Modified launch vehicle. 3 of them, actually. We need redundancy. The Paran drive goes in the payload section of each one, with a human-built interface that can run on partial function if necessary. We launch all 3 on staggered trajectories, so if the first 2 fail, the third one has a corrected path based on observed error." "That's—" Toru was quiet for a moment. "That's 3 chances. Humans always need 3 chances," Kenji said. "It's our thing." There was a sound from the other end of the line that might have been a laugh. "I'll call Rika. She'll already be awake." They had 110 days. The assembly happened in the same kind of frantic, grinding, sleep-deprived collaboration that had built every other significant human thing under deadline. With argument and stubbornness and wrong turns and moments of terrible doubt and small private victories celebrated with terrible coffee and the particular gallows humor that people develop when they are doing something enormous and terrifying and don't have time to be properly frightened about it. Hoshi worked alongside the engineers. There was an image, taken by a technician who posted it against regulations, and which was subsequently shared approximately 40 million times, of Hoshi standing beside a human engineer at a wiring panel, both of them looking at the same problem from slightly different angles, 2 completely different forms of intelligence, approaching the same equation from opposite ends, meeting in the middle. The human engineer was gesturing. Hoshi's amber eye was fixed on the wires, with an expression that the internet, collectively, decided to interpret as recognition. Kenji was everywhere. He slept in the facility, ate in the facility, called his wife every night from the facility, and said he was fine. And she did not believe him, but supported him anyway, which was the real architecture of his life, and had been for 20 years. His daughter called once and said, "Dad, I want to help." "You are," he said. "Everything you're doing right now, school, learning, asking questions, you're building the foundation of what comes after. We need there to be an after." She was quiet for a moment. "Then is there going to be?" He didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the assembly floor through the window of the elevated observation deck, at the 3 vehicles in various stages of completion, at the human and Paran engineers working side by side in the cold facility light, at the accumulated weight of everything both species had brought to this moment. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I think so." The launch was set for day 94. Day 88, the first crisis. The Paran drive interface on Vehicle 1 developed a feedback resonance that no one had predicted, and everyone immediately had a theory about. It took 60 hours of continuous work, 3 total redesigns of the interface coupling, and one moment where Rika stood in the middle of the assembly floor at 4 in the morning and said, to no one in particular, "I know what the problem is," and then went to a whiteboard and wrote for 40 minutes without stopping, while everyone stood around her in silence. The solution worked. Day 92, the second crisis. The global political coalition required to authorize the launch. Because of course authorization was required, because human beings threatened to collapse over a dispute about who would control the trajectory data. 3 countries insisted on independent verification. 2 others refused to provide ground tracking support unless their contributions were acknowledged in the official record. One minister, in a moment that Takahashi described afterward as the most infuriating thing I have witnessed in 30 years of government, held up the process for 16 hours over the precise wording of a press release. Kenji did not scream he wanted to. He sat in the meeting room and breathed through his nose, and remembered that these people were also afraid, that this was how fear sometimes looked on powerful people. And then, he said, with the carefully managed patience of a man who has been managing himself across a very long crisis, "We can have the argument about credit after the planet survives. Those are the only 2 options in order. Would you like to continue?" They continued. Day 94, the launch. The bay at dawn was cold and still, and the mist sat low on the water in layers. The 3 vehicles stood on their temporary pads at the harbor facility, pointed at a sky that was just beginning to lighten in the east, and Kenji stood at the observation barrier with Rika on one side and Hoshi on the other, and watched the countdown tick down on the board. He had a thermos of tea, old habit. The tea was warm, he had remembered this time. Beside him, Hoshi's limbs shifted in the slow, complex pattern that the team had learned to associate with something like internal tension. Not fear exactly. Hoshi's emotional vocabulary was too different for exact translation, but anticipation waited with uncertainty. Kenji recognized it because he felt it himself. He offered the thermos. He did this without thinking, purely from habit, the way you offer something to a person standing beside you in the cold. And then he felt briefly absurd, because Hoshi was a starfish-shaped alien from a civilization that predated human written language, and a thermos of green tea was perhaps not. Hoshi reached out a limb end and curled it gently around the thermos, and held it for a moment, amber eye turning to look at it. Then Hoshi turned and looked at Kenji, and held it back out, and the gesture was so unmistakably, "Thank you but no," that Kenji almost laughed. "Next time," he said. Hoshi's limbs did the pattern again slower. The closest approximation in human gesture would have been a nod. The countdown reached 0. All 3 vehicles lifted on columns of fire that turned the mist to vapor and the vapor to light. And they rose into the lightning sky in sequence. First one, and then the second, and then the third, and the sound of it hit the bay like a wave. Deep, physical, chest-filling, the accumulated roar of everything built and everything at stake. Kenji felt his eyes go wet, and did not bother to do anything about it. Vehicle 1 went first on schedule. The Paran drive engaged at the calculated point, and the vessel burned true toward the distant coordinates where planet R moved through the dark. Vehicle 2, 7 seconds behind, followed the same arc. Vehicle 3, the insurance, the human habit of building in one more chance, was 12 seconds behind Vehicle 2, its trajectory already corrected by data from the first 2. They waited. The wait was 8 days. 8 days during which the world watched and argued and prayed, and did everything humans do when facing something larger than themselves, which is mostly to hold on to each other and insist, with varying degrees of conviction, that it will be all right. The Parans waited with them in the facility, patient and still in the way of beings who had faced this before, and knew what waiting for the outcome felt like. On the fourth day, the first results came back. Vehicle 1's drive had functioned at 93% of projected output, below optimal, but within the range Rika had built the backup calculation for. Vehicle 2 had impacted as planned, its drive firing in concert with the first vehicle's residual effect. The combined force had deflected Planet R's trajectory by 0.03 degrees. It sounds small. At those distances, at those velocities, 0.003 degrees is the width of the universe. Vehicle 3 was not needed, but it was there, tracking and ready, because that was who built it. The confirmation came on day 8, at 4 in the morning Tokyo time, to a room full of people who had been awake for most of the previous week. Toru got the data first and stood at his station, staring at it for a moment with an expression that couldn't decide whether to be relief or disbelief, and then he said very quietly, "It's moved." Nobody screamed. Nobody cheered immediately. There was a moment of absolute silence, the held breath of people who have been brushing against something and have suddenly, unexpectedly, been able to let it go. Then Rika Matsuda sat down on the floor, in the middle of the facility, in her thin coat that had never been exchanged for a warmer one, and covered her face with her hands, and her shoulders shook for a long time. No one disturbed her. Everyone understood. Hoshi came to the observatory on the last day. The Parans were leaving. The crisis resolved, the collaboration complete, the mutual obligations honored. There would be a follow-up, contacts, formal agreements, the long, slow business of two civilizations figuring out how to exist in relationship to each other. But the 11 beings who had crossed 5 light years to knock on a sleeping world's door were going home, and Hoshi had asked, through the communication array, to see the telescope. Kenji walked Hoshi through the facility. He showed the great scope, the observation dome, the stacks of notebooks and data drives, the photographs pinned to bulletin boards, and the coffee-stained tables where so many night calculations had been done. Hoshi moved through all of it, slowly, amber eye moving over everything with an attention that was the same quality regardless of what it was looking at. The 1,000-year telescope and the paper cups were equally real, equally worthy of seeing. At the main scope, Kenji offered Hoshi the eyepiece. This was also an absurd gesture. The scope wasn't calibrated for whatever Hoshi's visual biology required, and in any case Hoshi could presumably access orbital data that made the whole instrument seem primitive. But Hoshi bent, that same bow, that fold of limbs, and applied the amber eye to the eyepiece and stayed still for a long moment. Kenji waited. Then Hoshi straightened and turned and made a gesture that the team had never catalogued before. All limbs extended and then slowly curled inward, like a star drawing itself together. It was the only time Kenji had seen the gesture, and he did not have a translation for it. But he had been watching Hoshi for months. He was not certain, would never be entirely certain, that it might mean something like, "This is what we have in common." He made what he hoped was a corresponding gesture. Both hands open, facing outward, and then slowly brought together. Hoshi's eye fixed on him. The amber depths of it were unreadable in any precise way. But Kenji had looked enough skies in his life to know when something was looking back. "Come back," he said, "when you want. There's always room for one more at the telescope." 3 weeks after the Paran ship left the bay, rising out of the water on a morning much like the one it had arrived on, lifting silently into a sky that watched it go with the particular attention of something that we'll remember, Kenji went back to the observatory. By himself on a regular Tuesday in the early evening, he brought a thermos of tea. He opened the dome and put his eye to the scope and looked at the stars for a long time. They looked the same. They always looked the same. That was both the terror and the comfort of it. The sky didn't record what had happened, didn't mark the crisis or the salvation, or the morning 11 beings from another world had stood in a line on a winter beach and bowed. The stars just kept burning. But Kenji knew something now that he hadn't known before. He knew, in the specific, irreversible way that you know a thing once you've seen the evidence with your own eyes, that somewhere out there, other telescopes were pointing at this particular star. That other eyes, amber and strange and watching, were looking back across the dark at the small blue point of light that was home. He wasn't afraid of that. He poured his tea. He adjusted the focus. He settled into his chair with the particular contentment of a man doing the thing he was built to do, in the place he was meant to do it, with the knowledge that the world outside would still be there when he was done. The stars burned on, steady and multiple and patient. Welcome to the neighborhood, he thought, and kept looking.